Good morning and welcome to today's episode of Energy Shots. I'm Joseph Majkut, Director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS. Kevin, it is September in Washington and trade is in the air. What's going on?
Should we disclose to the people on the other end that this is being pre-recorded? Oops, I just let it out of the bag. Well, it is. So in case anything we say in the next 15 minutes is superseded by events, now you know. You did bring up trade. Last time we were here, we were talking about labor and Labor Day weekends, and then that afternoon, the afternoon of the 29th of August, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit came out with a ruling on the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to set tariffs. That was a big day.
Yes, it was.
And then on September 3rd, the president and the administration appealed it to the Supreme Court.
And what is the forecast for when we may hear a ruling on whether or not these tariffs are even legal as a trade and political tool?
Well, possibly before the end of the year. They petitioned for expedited review. They haven't been given an answer as of today, whether or not that will be the case. But they asked for that answer by September 10th. So by the time this airs, it may be known whether it's expedited.
I hear you. But one of the developments we've seen over the last year is the use of tariffs with a national security justification to achieve a much broader trade agenda.
This is the big tool in the chest.
And that's what we want to talk a little bit about today, because over the summer, we actually saw trade deals realized under the threat of large tariffs from the United States.
With bilateral bargains that included energy purchasing agreements.
Exactly. And one of the key questions that I know you've gotten and I've gotten as well, when we see these enormous announcements of large trade volumes with the U.S. leveraging its energy resources to restore the trade balance, we hear, is it possible for this to happen? Walk us through some of these numbers, if you would.
Well, first of all, it is possible for energy to narrow trade balances because energy is valuable and we sell a lot of it. On the other hand, if you look at the red bar here, this is $306 billion in harmonized tariff schedule chapter 27, which is to say most of the energy stuff that we export as we classify it here in the United States, in dollar value, $306 billion over the 12 months through July in everything lock, stock, and two smoking barrels that we sell. Okay, so that is sort of a baseline of what everything we are exporting was worth through July.
Right.
And in the middle, what you have are in 4 trade deals. So we have the deal with the EU, which is the biggest at $250 billion a year, which I know you have definitely gotten a lot of questions about. Like, isn't that a really big number? Yes.
Yes.
It's 3 times what we are currently exporting to the EU in value. And then also Indonesia and South Korea and Malaysia. There were other bargains struck, but not all of those bargains came with managed trade purchasing targets.
Right.
But these targets come up to about 95% of that total, which if you sort of say, well, that's just 4 countries and we're exporting to dozens of countries all over the world, that makes it seem a little bit less feasible. And then if you look at this last column down here, Joseph, what you have is a comparison to what's going on right now.
Yes.
So through those 12 months through July, that's what the total looks like.
So let's take a minute to interpret this. So this is the entire export of energy goods from the United States. And over here is what you have actually going to the countries with whom we've struck a deal. And this is what we've promised.
Well, yes, with a caveat.
Yes.
So this big bar, this chapter 27 bar that we're talking about, is mostly fossil fuels and that sort of thing.
Right.
It doesn't include nuclear technologies, which could be a big part of this. It also doesn't count the total value of a deal signed. So if you conflate stocks with flows and you say, well, you signed a sale and purchase agreement for LNG for 20 years, well, if we count all 20 years in 1 year, which doesn't exactly work from a math perspective, but from a political math perspective, kind of works. If you did that, you might be able to make these numbers, but you have to start thinking about including some nuclear into this too.
I got it. Now, and then also you need to think about, well, are we going to see this number, should we realize these deals, this total go up because you've got trade with the rest of the world still ongoing?
Well, I mean, I think that's a possibility, and we still need the molecules to be able to move, and we need the facilities to be able to move those molecules in liquid form for gas. Let's move to the next slide, because I think there's some more perspective to think about just when you look about those existing percentages and what we're currently sending. Right now, this is, again, that full category. The EU is taking 26% of that category, just one. China's taking 3%, Indonesia 1%, Japan 4%, South Korea at 5%, the UK, where we also have a bilateral bargain, though not with purchasing targets, 4%. And then again, this is the whole category. Now let's just go to plain old LNG. The coin of the realm in bilateral bargains, though.
Right.
You know, it's been much talked about. When we look at the percentage there, the EU is at 54% by value of the LNG that we've been sending out through July. And some of the other recipients, Japan, a much bigger recipient overall of LNG compared to the sort of the full portfolio at 6%, and the UK at 7%. So you need to find a way to be able to move more molecules, which we have the molecules under our feet. America is very rich in molecules. We also need the infrastructure to move those molecules to the coasts, and then in the case of gas, liquefy before shipping.
And isn't this the energy dominance agenda? Marrying a domestic policy, which is enthusiastic about production, with a foreign policy that's enthusiastic about energy exports?
I think that's how we would define energy dominance. It's a production-focused export policy, or it's an export-focused production policy, but it definitely has both production and exports, which I think brings up a question. How dominant is it?
Well, this is something that I wanted to contribute to today's discussion because a couple things came across my radar in the past week. If I can get, there it is. You know, like this is a slightly different way of looking at the same numbers. On the right-hand side here, you've got for the month of June 2025,
okay.
My rough approximation of the export revenues associated with LNG from the United States.
So that's $3.1 billion.
Out to the whole world, and crude oil. And I think, you know, it's interesting that LNG is the coin of the realm, and yet crude oil is a much larger by dollar export category than LNG.
More fungible, too.
And then if you come over here, these are Chinese exports for the same month of solar goods, of batteries, and of EVs.
Whoa, wait a second. I think you just said something controversial. If I look at those numbers, that's $9.5 billion in green goods from China. That's 3x the value of our LNG exports.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's like when we think about the energy dominance agenda with the Trump administration, it has been a fossil fuel agenda.
Yeah.
And if you look at what global markets are wanting to buy, you make a US and China comparison, I think I'm going to want to watch over the next few years, and maybe in another episode, take a look at some time series, this comparison. You can compare them in dollars. It's not the same as in energy. We've talked about that before. Right. But when we think about where the energy system as a whole is going, and the U.S. wanting to play a export-driven role in the future energy system, I'm wondering if we might want to find a little diversification.
Well, wait a second, though. There's also a Ricardian argument one could make here, right? We've got the rocks, and they've got the factories. So maybe what we're seeing is a certain amount of specialization.
Right.
There was always a fairly tall premise to talk about turning the United States into a clean manufacturing superpower. When it first came up in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, it was a very, very tall proposition. But even with the IRA, there was a lot of gaps to close, especially when you look at the factor cost differentials vis-a-vis China, and for that matter, the skill, the workforce, the size of the engineering workforce. There's a lot of deltas.
I totally agree. I'm not saying that we can totally map one. And maybe what we find is as the U.S. and China negotiate whatever trade deal they may or may not come to, that some sort of trade along this energy fuels for energy infrastructure will be part of the deal.
Interesting. Well, so all of this is premised on trade deals that are being driven by IEEPA powers.
Right.
Now, there are alternate scenarios. There are other tariffs at work that could be used to try to bring pressure on trade partners.
Right.
And there's other tariffs that have been proposed. Last episode, I believe we flirted very, very gently with the topic of carbon border adjustments.
Yes, we did. Where we were thinking about, like when the trade, as the administration tries to realize its trade impulses, to bring manufacturing back to the United States, to emphasize the ability of the U.S. to be a clean producer around the world. We talked about carbon intensity. And what we can see here in the bubble chart is the energy intensity of GDP.
That's on the x-axis down here.
That's on the x-axis.
Okay.
Between the U.S. and the rest of the G7, and China, BRICS, and the rest of the G20.
Well, the y-axis is the carbon intensity.
And y-axis is in the carbon intensity, so what jumps out to you immediately?
Well, down here, closing in on the origin of the chart, is the clean and lean section.
Yes.
And here's the higher emitting, higher consuming section. And what we can see are that the sort of the aggregate economic West, the G7 and the US, and the bubble size is the share of global consumption, by the way, is in a totally different place than China, for example, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the non-G7, G20, and also the BRICS. So essentially the competing economies, the competing major economies that are manufacturing superpowers or energy export superpowers in their own right have a very different profile. So Senator Bill Cassidy, as we know, is proposed the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, most recently reproposed, I think, in April with Senator Graham. If there were another tariff tool created, this is a tariff tool that, at least in theory, would favor the U.S. By providing some sort of structural measure of capturing that U.S. advantage.
Exactly right. And it would be potentially something that you could negotiate with a variety of other countries. You could team up with the rest of the G7 as opposed to perhaps antagonizing them. And you could realize, perhaps, also in theory, long-term bipartisan support for this sort of new trade regime that we find ourselves stumbling into.
Well, let's just go over the magnitude of this again, because I think it bears some repeating. The G7 in the aggregate is 1/3 as energy intensive of GDP compared to these other groupings.
Service economy versus productive economy?
Yes, but also a much cleaner energy mix. Let's go to the next slide, actually. If you look at the carbon intensity, and of course, if you have lower energy consumption as a share for each dollar you generate in GDP, and you have a cleaner mix, then you're going to have a lower carbon intensity. And here you have more than a 3x delta compared to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization members. And so you can see just a very wide gap. I think if you break this down just a little further, dare we break it down further?
Absolutely.
We dare. Here on Energy Shots, we dare. And what you can see over here on the far left side, blooming as it does just now, is that total share of energy consumption. The G7 is actually fairly light, 30% of global energy consumption. When you look at the non-G7, G20s member states, more than half of the world's energy consumption concentrated in those states, despite the fact that this definition of G7 includes the rest of the EU that isn't specifically in the G7. And when you look at the fossil energy share of generation, 48% for the G7, more than 60, nearly 2/3 fossil energy share of generation in these other groupings. And then if you look at where where push comes to shove in the end, the G7 is still economically more than half of the global GDP. So all these other players, all these other groupings have to think about where they are in terms of the market they want to serve. And in that integrated sort of cohesive trade framework you were describing, maybe aspirationally today, but we'll see where it goes in the future, this 52% sort of defines why they want to get involved.
Well, and if you think about it from a climate perspective, there's an incredible incentive to try to access this marketplace with your productive goods. And if that's a place where you find border adjustment, because many of the countries in the G7 are already using carbon pricing, they already have some sort of border adjustment. If they're in the EU, the UK is flirting with this as well. Japan is standing up programs. You access a large part of the global economy in a carbon measured way.
Now, to be fair, I don't know that the Trump administration is currently thinking about it in a climate perspective.
No.
But in a fragmenting world, in a bottom-up world of trying to find compelling economic advantage to provide national sovereign self-interest, if the numbers work, the numbers work.
Yes, I think that's right. What are you watching for in the next few weeks, Kevin?
Well, I think we want to see what happens next on IEEPA. We have Climate Week in New York, and with it, the UN General Assembly. Let's not forget that we're in the middle of a snapback window for Iran sanctions. And speaking of sanctions, maybe this could be the next episode, we'll be wondering what happens with regard to Russia, since the president has indicated that he's moving to phase 2, or maybe he's willing to move to phase 2, perhaps only if Europe moves first. There's a lot of scenarios there. Joseph, what's on your plate?
I am watching the coevolution of AI and energy issues here in the United States. I'm also watching what's going to happen with the court case regarding tariffs. I think if one very interesting scenario is if those fall, then the administration needs to start thinking about how it's going to realize its broader trade agenda using a variety of different tools. Are they going to start with what we've talked about today? Probably not. But may we end there in a couple of years? I think it's possible.
Well, something to keep watching. We'll look forward to, I think, next episode. Lots changing very fast. September's a busy month.
Yes, colleagues, thank you for joining us. Kevin, always a pleasure. Hope you have an energetic day.